Right now, though, let's talk to Conservative MP, former Brexit Secretary David Davis. Good morning to you, David.
Good morning.
Good morning. I also have to point out.
I'm just sitting. I'm just sitting here, imagining, some big burly SBS soldiers collecting £10,000 apiece from these.
Absolutely. Well, I was going to ask you about this Special Forces story because, of course, you trained with the SAS, weren't you, in the
Yeah,
Territorial Army?
that,
What do you make of the Special Forces storming the oil tanker? Apparently, after a 10-hour standoff, took them 9 minutes. Sent the helicopters in, snipers in the helicopters. I think, some 16 members of the Special Boat Service boarding the vessel. Took them 9 minutes to seize control.
I guess it's only about a 5-minute helicopter flight from Poole, which is the headquarters.
Yeah.
And I doubt, frankly, that it was one of their hardest ever tasks. I mean, this bunch of stowaways, basically. I don't know how well organised they were, but it wouldn't have been that difficult for them to subdue them. I mean, the main problem would have been whether they knifed a member of the crew, something like that. And the difficulty there is speed, really, speed and stealth, and they're very good at all of that. So I would think you're dead right. The crew must have breathed a sigh of relief that they picked there to do it, not in the middle of the ocean.
Absolutely. Well, look, let's bring things a bit closer back to home. Let's talk about the various pickles that the Tory government have got themselves in. You're the man who helped campaign.
Now we got a whole Branston of them, I guess.
We are, yeah. I mean, we really do, don't we? And it's not the fine cut ones either. It's the big chunky kind of problems.
Yeah.
Let's go through them in turn, because the one that's on a lot of the front pages, as well as the Special Forces situation, is Marcus Rashford. The millionaire footballer's just got huge support after he's called for free school meal vouchers for the poorest kids to be. He won last time round. The government did a U-turn. The government's saying they're not going to give out these vouchers during this October half term, not doing it for Christmas, but they are saying there will be more cash for poorest families. The government is saying, look, this issue is much more complicated than that, and you need to tackle the issue with not just vouchers or money, but with actually long-term help for these families. Is the government right, or do you think the government should U-turn?
Well, truth is both. I mean, they are right in that they did create a £60 million fund for local councils to deal with some of these issues directly. They did increase universal credit by about £1,000 a year, but these actually, for a variety of reasons, these don't actually solve the problems. Not everybody gets universal credit. The so-called legacy welfare people. Not all the councils use the money in the way that would have met the Marcus Rashford requirement, if you like. But on the other hand, the schools at the end of the day are not should not be a primary arm of our welfare state. So there is a problem. I mean, if you want to look to the sort of wisest person around on this, look at Robert Halfon. Halfon, who voted against the government last week. Who's the chairman of the Education Committee, and said in terms, no one has a monopoly on benevolence or compassion in this, and it's a really complicated issue. It's got to, you've got things involved in this, like, what about the responsibility of the parents? You're going to bypass the parents every single time in this? Is the state going to take command of that? So it's quite complicated. I think the government's going to have to move. I don't think they have to do what Lashford's asking, but I do think they have to move to help deal with the problem.
But this is the thing, the government's constantly saying, well, this isn't the way to deal with it, we're not going to U-turn, and then they always end up U-turning, don't they? I mean, if they genuinely think they are right, then they shouldn't be if they think it's a waste of our money, our taxpayers, our money after all they're handing out, and that there's a better way to make sure children don't go hungry, they should stick to their guns. But they tend not to stick to their guns.
And partly because it's a spectacular handling disaster. I mean, and as it was last time. I mean, the things I've just talked about, the 60 million fund, the sizable increase in universal credit, and so on. These are not new. These were known beginning of last week. Where was the government making this case at the beginning? It's making it now, but it sort of walked almost blindfold into a political disaster from its handling point of view, and I think that's part of the problem. I think, in truth, what you started out with, talking about the number of pickles we're in. I think that to some extent the government machinery has become overwhelmed, partly by COVID and by other things, and it's not been very good at foresight, at seeing what's coming next. It's one of the great tricks of great governments and great leadership is to see what's coming next and deal with it early, not wait until you've got a great panic on your hands.
Okay, well, let's talk about another one of the pickles then, and also another one of the political disasters, and looking at things ahead. All three counts for Dido Harding. Baroness Dido Harding brought in to handle the test and trace situation. Under no circumstances, there is no way in which you could actually rate the running of this system and think that it was good in terms of the inability to trace, the inability to get test results back quickly and the like. In which case, do you agree with your colleague Sir Bernard Jenkin, who's of course Tory MP and chair of the liaison committee? Do you think that he's right that Dido Harding should be forced out or should quit?
Well, he's half right. I mean, what Dido wants, what Bernard argues, I think, is that they should put a sort of military commander in charge of this. I think he's wrong about that. But there's no doubt that there is this, disaster is probably not too strong a word for it. I mean, if you compare us to someone like South Korea, who had managed to do in weeks what we have failed to do in 6 months in terms of setting up a testing, tracking, tracing, and isolation. Not forget the last bit, and isolation policy. They managed to do that in matter of 6 weeks, I think, 6-7 weeks, and as a result, they've had a much better outcome than us. Germany, to some extent, the same. So it's not just one country or just one culture. And we failed to do that. Now, part of it, I mean, I think the biggest part is just the machinery, so-called machinery of government. I mean, why we keep handing out these contracts to these big companies like Serco and Sitel and so on, who frankly have not delivered. They've been very, very poor. They started out, I mean, the head of one of them said something to the effect, oh, well, we're not going to get this running anything before September. He said this like 4 months ago. I mean, that's part of the problem. So there's a systemic problem. In terms of, I mean, we can put too much faith in the individual running it. I happen to think that it perhaps wasn't the smartest thing to give it to Dido Harding. She's a perfectly competent businesswoman, but I wouldn't employ, I don't know, an oil refiner to run a retail chain.
But exactly, why is Sir Bernard Jenkin wrong in suggesting sort of military commander, a senior person who's literally been trained for years to run a crisis situation involving huge logistics? That is what they are trained to do. Why not put someone like that in charge?
The trouble is that I think the problem's a bit simpler than that. I mean, the problem is one of running a set of contracts. I mean, let me give you an example. I asked a question of the department several months ago. I just said, what are the penalty clauses in place if Serco don't deliver? If the companies involved don't deliver. It took them 3 months to come back, and eventually they said, oh, we don't have any penalty
You're
clauses.
kidding me.
No. It actually said, in English law, it's difficult to have penalty clauses. Well, I never found
Rubbish,
that.
you have a penalty clause if you have a builder in.
Exactly. There are no bloody penalty clauses. I mean, that's why I say it's not about having the commander is in a way.
Well, hold on a minute. When people talk about Dido Harding, are we not missing the point? Isn't it actually the case that the person who hired Dido Harding, who isn't doing the job properly and who's allowing contracts to be signed which are not up to scratch, which wouldn't pass muster in any private business? Isn't it down fundamentally to either Matt Hancock or Boris Johnson? Are they not fundamentally ultimately to blame?
Well, I think the way they've organised the government is problematic, and where you put the blame for that, where you can pick. But when they started out in government, actually, but almost before this crisis hit us, they heavily centralised Downing Street. Famously, Mr. Cummings appointed all his own special advisors under all of the cabinet ministers and so on, and centralised the decision making. Now, when you centralise something, by definition, you take more of the decisions, and those decisions come more rapidly, and they are decisions that you are not expert in, right? And that's what's been going on. I mean, a lot of these decisions have been made by Downing Street. It's got that in common with the Marcus Rashford
Rashford.
Rashford, I beg his pardon. Marcus Rashford issue. They're trying to take too many decisions at the centre, and as a result, making mistakes. And I think they're both examples of the same thing there.
Okay, what do
and
you?
I'm afraid it comes down to Cummings more than anything else. But at the end
Well,
of
it
the
comes
day,
down to the person who employs Cummings, surely. At the end of the day,
yes, exactly.
let's talk about
Yeah.
centralised decisions, because one of the decisions the government has decided not to make is to have a full national lockdown. Don't call it a circuit breaker or a fire breaker. It's just another national lockdown. Wales and Northern Ireland have gone ahead. Wales are in a lot of hot water. Mark Drakeford, the First Minister there, over this absurd non-essential shops being forced to close, therefore non-essential items not being sold in supermarkets. What do you make of that decision, and what do you make of the likelihood that we may end up following suit in England?
Well, I think one of your listeners at some point said, we've got to follow the science. One of your contributors, and the trouble is, the science in this is incredibly weak. As they admitted themselves in a government document on Monday of last week, a week ago today, they actually admitted that this is very, the evidence for national lockdowns working is very weak. But the second problem with the so-called circuit breaker is it's going to be more like a power cut than a circuit breaker, because you go in, how the devil are you going to get out? The way other countries came out of their lockdowns, who were the ones who were successful, were the ones who had, and we're back to the same problem, effective test, track, trace, and isolate policies. Yeah. They're the ones who did it. Look at Germany. And when they, by the way, when the Germans lock down, they can lock down to a single street, or to a block of flats, or a factory in its dormitory building. That's the sort of level of control. And of course, that lockdown works. Whereas if you lock down 3 million people, let alone 60 million people, but let's say 3 million people in Manchester, Greater Manchester, then there are going to be thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who break the lockdown one way or another. Yeah. Whereas if it's very small, you can police it. But for it to be very small, you've got to have a test, track, and trace. We
come back to that issue, don't we?
We come back. It's so fundamental.
All right. Just finally, because I've not got much time and we've got another guest to get to, but very briefly, if you would, Brexit, more talks going on. The talks that were ended way over the deadline of October the 15th. Are we going to get a Brexit deal or not?
Am I going to sound like a crack record now? Do you remember the first 3 years matters less than the last 3 weeks? Well, not yet at the last 3 weeks. It will go on and it will go on, and we will eventually get a deal. That's my best guess. I think it's about 75-80% probable.
Okay. David Davis, thank you very much indeed, Conservative MP, former Brexit Secretary.